Beneil Dariush is a UFC fighter perpetually beloved by the freaks and geeks, myself included. Until he ran into Charles Oliveira and a rampaging Armand in quick succession, he had been on a feel-good win streak that brought him to a title eliminator in an all-but-name fight, the kind of which we hadn't seen since Tony's Boogeyman run. He's finally back in the win column a few weeks ago, at time of writing this, at UFC 317, overcoming an early knockdown at the end of round 1 to Mag Money Moicano in rounds 2 and 3. Benny's a quintessential underdog, from his prematurely gray hair, to dad bod, to unsexy game plan that involves elite defensive grappling and bonks on the feet amidst prodding kicks. Now, of course, he's amazing on the technical side, more so in grappling than striking, as he does a lot of really interesting tactics and moves that keep him a cut above the rest. Something that has always interested me about Benny is his grappling background. His first combat sport was gi jiu-jitsu, starting at the age of 18. The reason this surprised me so much was how well developed his wrestling is, especially on the defensive end, even grading on the scale of elite MMA wrestlers. I had assumed that he had a more extensive wrestling background, partially because I knew he was from Iran originally, and partially because of how damn good he is, so knowing this was a secondary skill set made things incredibly interesting. Jack Slack has commented on his takedown defense more than a few times, calling it hostile. His strength is definitely a part of it, but there are a lot of guys much stronger who are god-awful at stopping the takedown compared to him. No, the more I watched of him, I realized that he has a fleshed out bag of tricks only seen in the likes of champions or contenders, the only other guys being on his tier of takedown defense in the UFC being men like Arman, Islam, and JDM. Most fighters just blindly sprawl in a double leg, or put in a whizzer and a knee shield against the cage on a single. These tactics are fine, if not ideal, but not optimal in terms of pure wrestling. Today I'm going to examine different parts of Beneil's takedown defense, how he gets back up from the ground, why it all works, and what you can learn about wrestling and grappling as a whole. Against Drew Dober, Beneil spends a lot of time on top before he falls off of Dober whilst attempting an armbar, ending in a seated turtle. He very quickly and decisively posts up on all fours and makes his way to the cage with Dober still having the rear body lock. A lack of mat returns is something I've harped on a lot in MMA grappling, especially cage grappling. If popular demand exists, I'll make an entire video on mat returns. But without the threat of the throw, the rear body lock is a relatively weak position against the cage. Most of the time I see guys either try to hit weird trips with the Japanese name from behind, or more commonly try to split the legs and put in a pseudo wrestling ride that just doesn't have a lot behind it. Outright hopping on the back also isn't usually ideal due to the threat of just falling off, and so unless the guy who's got you against the cage is someone like Khabib, Charlie, or an elite wrestler like DC, we end up in a weird stalling exchange. Beneil, I imagine, knows this, and is noticeably calm whenever he ends up here in his fights, just a little detail I enjoy. After cutting an angle to start turning into Dober, he sits out onto the cage, something I really love. The sit-out is a great defense to having your back taken in general, as long as you intend on initiating a scramble. He does appear to grab the cage during the turn, but I'm not sure whether it affected anything. And as he completes the turn, he grabs Dober's leg, going for a full knee down onto the mat. I'm really gushing about a very short exchange, but is generally symptomatic of his larger game, and I love immediately counterattacking with a takedown of his own. Dober pulls guard instead of offering an intelligent defense, which is kinda dumb considering how close to the cage they are. Dariush passes and completes an inverted triangle armbar for the W because that's just how our boy rolls. Versus Carlos Diego Ferreira. After roughly 2 minutes and 10 seconds of wild striking and offensive grappling by Benny, Ferreira goes in for one of the laziest shots I've ever seen all time, dropping into a full crouch with his hands on his hips before basically just trust falling towards Benny's legs. Benny does something I absolutely love, hooking under his throat with the right arm, connecting with his left in a pseudo-guillotine grip, but with the primary intention of just tossing him over. In wrestling, an actual full all-or-nothing sprawl is supposed to be the tertiary defense after your opponent has gotten past your head and arms as line of defenses. And stuffing or pushing the head is a great way not just to stop the takedown, but to put them in a really vulnerable position to a counterattack, especially to circle and take the back. And Beneil ends in a weird half guard that involves him doing the splits. Later, with 2 minutes to go in the final round, a caught kick forces Dariush to roll backwards. He gets initially caught past his V-point, as G. Diddy would call it, but keeps rolling until he regains half guard, and immediately attacks the leg lock. As he attempts to pull the foot of Diego across his body, he also turns to a hip, allowing himself to very easily build a base, and just like that, he's up. In a mirror to the first exchange I noted, within the final 20 seconds our hero falls off the back again, and without any hesitation rolls to deep half, looking for the rear side heel hook immediately, but unable to finish it given how far out of the lock Fajera's knee is. Diego does the technical defense of turning back in carefully and pulling his knee back out, and just like that, he's free. Dariush does what he should and immediately goes to his base, attempting a bad faith single attempt that means he won't eat any ground strikes in the last 5 seconds, something that could affect a very close fight. Against our beloved Tony Ferguson, Beneil holds a dominant position for much of the fight amidst some very crafty submission attempts from El Kukui, including a darce from his own guard, and some sneaky armbar and triangle setups utilizing rubber guard techniques. In an event that should not surprise you, given the 2 previous instances, Beneil, wait for it, falls off of Tony's back. It's probably one of his most common mistakes as a fighter, but more or less fine in how good he is at recovery, but I could see how falling off of someone who's really good at ground and pound could absolutely fuck himself over. He's initially in a weird bottom side control, before turning away to create a leg entanglement. Tony initially hides his heel well, but Beneil is able to find an opening to attack the heel hook. The attempt is very funny, but Tony skates by, partially due to his trademark stubbornness, and partially due to the way he uses his right leg to keep Beneil's left from connecting to help restrict his knee, as it's not quite locked down well enough for a finish. Regardless, Beneil bails and takes top, reversing his mistake. The rest of the fight is purely Beneil on top, and he easily beats our beloved Boogeyman against Mateusz Gamrot. In my opinion, this is Beneil's masterpiece, as he engages in wrestling with one of the most underratedly exciting fighters in the UFC, none other than the indomitable Gamrot. This is a sort of separate aside, but the Gamrot being boring angle is something that's never really rung true to me for similar reasons to the idea of Murat being boring, as I find them to be very similar fighters. Both have limitless gas tanks, uncrackable chins, and incredibly fluid takedown arsenals. Granted, a big part of my enjoyment of Gamrot in particular is that I'm a huge nerd for sophisticated wrestling exchanges, but the dude also just has a crazy output and eats strikes on the chin. That gripe aside, the incredibly fluid wrestling of Gamrot means that Beneil will have to defend incredibly quickly and at a volume he hasn't come anywhere close to being subject to before. The first takedown comes within 5 seconds, and Beneil does what I talked about earlier, putting his head in the way so that the takedown is stopped before Gamrot is even on the hips, let alone makes him need to sprawl. After another 20 seconds, Dariush leaves himself at a weird angle due to a kick, and Gamrot pounces, getting deep on a double. Rather than going straight backward, Dariush tries to move at an angle, falling onto his right hip. As soon as he hits the ground, he tries to post on the leg even as Gamrot briefly holds onto his knee, and even as Gamrot circles to put in an ankle bite, Beneil begins the limp leg. The motion with which Gamrot chases another single once Dariush stands back up also causes him to somewhat humorously fall over. Although not the sexiest grappling sequence of all time, Dariush just turned another takedown attempt by his opponent into a successful takedown for himself, something a top player like him can capitalize well on. Gamrot Granby rolls and does a really good job of grabbing one of the leg hooks as he does so, turning in and taking top. Beneil pushes and turns to his knees, going for a roll of his own that gets him to balls in mouth position, but the resulting heel hook attempt allows him to once again turn in, momentarily sitting in a position that's sort of like a crackdown before standing up, Gamrot still holding the back body lock. He very calmly pushes down the hands to fight the grip, and then returns back to resume striking. A kick gets Beneil in trouble once again at 3:18 remaining as Gamrot catches it, but before it's even landed, Beneil sits up to build posture and quickly turns the turtle, once again rolling for a heel hook before bailing and standing up. Gamrot almost immediately reshoots, but Beneil gets underhooks and attempts a turnover, swinging Gamrot clockwise. The motion isn't quite enough to get him off, but he lands in an ankle bite, reaching around for wrist control as both men start to stand. He cranks on the wrist lock, perhaps wanting an armbar or Kimura setup, and even tries to put his foot on Gamrot's hand to break the grip, but he creates enough pressure to return Gamrot back to the mat. Eventually he's forced to release the grip and simply stands back up. Through the first minutes of the second round, we see a bunch of shots intercepted by Dariush, who once again uses his head and hands to defend long before he needs to sprawl, for example at 320, stopping the initial shot with an attempted turnover via underhooks, and then limp-legging out of the secondary shot. Grabbing those underhooks work for Beneil pretty often, and it absolutely adds to the Haas aura, as it seems like his dad's strength can help hurl people around with relative ease when he gets a good grip. At 223, Gamrot hits an absolutely filthy sequence, basically pump-faking Beneil with a shot feint, hitting a punch, and then going in for a real shot. Beneil's aided in the defense somewhat by the fact that his right arm ends up inside of Gamrot's shoulders in the beginning of the takedown, allowing him to help push Gamrot away from him and allow for the sprawl. He once again falls onto his right hip and starts turning clockwise, basically doing mountain climbers while stuffing the head of Gamrot. As soon as he breaks his posture enough, he then once again limp legs. Posture is another important part of wrestling, often overlooked in MMA, as basically trying to shove someone's face into the mat and or dribble it like a basketball is ideal takedown defense. The reason for this importance is that you want to be moving towards your target and taking away space before driving through them for the finish, and if your posture is poor, then it makes it easier to simply shove you down, away, and create distance. Many wrestling coaches will call you a crotch sniffer for not keeping disciplined posture on the shot. Gamrot whiffs on another shot before getting in deep on one with 11 seconds to spare in the round. Against the cage, Dariush can't create the kind of space he wants by pushing in, and instead he just decides to land as much damage as he can before the end of the round, throwing punches until Gamrot turns him off of the cage, finally getting the single and going to a leg entanglement, but with no time to capitalize. 11 seconds into the third, Gamrot goes in on a double leg, but as Dariush begins to circle well, Gamrot instead circles to the back for the leg lock entry instead of the takedown, not achieving anything but resetting the neutral eventually. At 252, we get another hostile exchange as Dariush violently underhooks the right arm of Gamrot, slamming him into the cage. The stubborn Polish fighter stays committed and instead starts working on a single on his left side, so Beneil switches sides whilst Gamrot does the same, and eventually Beneil just ends up underhooking the other arm and freeing his legs. In doing so, Gamrot does get a body lock against the cage, but Beneil is able to force his way off the wall. At 130, Beneil hits a Falcon Punch.
Fighting for the championship.
Punch! Huge left for Dariush!
And presumably by the grace of his incredibly thick skull, Gamrot is not flatlined, instead almost reflexively grabbing a single for survival's sake. It's pretty easily defended, but also a pretty strong demonstration of human willpower. Gamrot tries to go again on a single leg at 35 seconds after a knee against the cage, and Beneil rotates well to take the back, but gets thrown off into north-south. In a Yuri-coded move, Beneil turns to his base and grabs a leg to stand up, ending the fight standing. This was a masterclass in takedown defense, especially against a guy with not just the cardio and volume of Gamrot, but the amount of takedown finishes and adjustments he has. It's a real shame Islam vs. Beneil never got rebooked after the cancellation, as although I'm sure Islam would either find the knockout or submit Beneil with a darce during a scramble or something, I'd kill to see how Beneil defended the highly refined and importantly efficient takedown offense of Islam, especially the judo throws, something we haven't seen Beneil deal with a ton. I thought about breaking down the recent Moicano fight for this, but it would both be a bitch to get around UFC copyright, and it would also be pretty repetitive. He mogs Moicano by stuffing the head, hitting turnovers, and generally controlling the posture really well. Regardless of what his future holds, I'll be rooting for Beneil. He's a fighter I think others should study, as his skill at wrestling is truly elite for the sport defensively. If you enjoyed this study, consider donating to my Ko-fi on the link below. I can't make any money off of ad revenue with videos using UFC footage. This is brought to you by viewers like yourself. Thank you.